Welcome to Let the Quran Speak. I'm Sophia, your host. Muslims believe that Islam empowered women when it came in the 7th century. At a time when daughters were being buried alive and women were considered property, the Prophet Muhammad preached that women were equal in the sight of God. Women had the right to retain their identity after marriage, to own property, to pursue education. And yet Muslim women in many parts of the world are disadvantaged compared to their male counterparts. Is there an Islamic impetus for redressing the imbalance between men and women? I'm joined by Dr. Shabir Ali, President of the Islamic Information Center, to discuss whether Islam can be used to further empower women today. Now, when the Prophet came to Arabia, the idea was that he revolutionized the way that women were perceived in society. Can you talk a little bit about how he did that?
Yes, one of the most striking ways is that we know from indications in the Quran and elsewhere that people at the time were practicing genetic selection in a most brutal manner, in that first a girl would be born and then they would bury the girl alive. Nowadays, of course, in some societies, some genetic selection is being done in a more subtle manner prior to birth. Mm-hmm. But in Arabia, this was terribly the way it was done. It's hard to even imagine that people would have done this, but the Quran spoke against this and says that people who do this would be brought to justice on the Day of Judgment. And the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, is reported to have said that if anyone brings up 2 daughters and gives them a good education and so on, and eventually gets them married off, then that person will be with me like this in paradise, which means very close to me in paradise. And that shows the beloved nature of this act to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. So in these and many other ways, the Prophet, peace be upon him, and the Quranic revelation showed that women are equal with men as human beings before God. They have rights, they have responsibilities, they are intelligent, they can contribute to human society just as much as men can, and they also have a responsibility to do that.
Mm-hmm. Was there recognition at the time in Arabia that the Prophet Muhammad was doing something very new and different? He was changing society around?
In many ways, this was recognized, and people opposed the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, for the innovations that he was instituting. Though the opposition to him was most marked in his with regards to his preaching about there being only one God and about the afterlife and about the sharing of wealth with the poor and the needy and the orphans and so on. I'm not aware of opposition being directed specifically to his treatment of women and his emancipation, you can say, or of women from the kinds of disadvantaged situations in which they were placed at that time. Mm-hmm. But it's not hard to imagine that this sort of opposition would have been there. It is noted, for example, in one narrative that a woman came to the Prophet, peace be upon him, and asked him, when men do all of these different things in the public and they get reward for these acts from God, what do women get? And the Prophet, peace be upon him, asked his companions, could you have imagined that a woman would have asked this question? Mm-hmm. And they said no. Well, that shows the state of affairs at the time, what people would have expected of women. And then the Prophet, peace be upon him, said that the women will get an equal reward with the men. And it is further reported that when the Prophet, peace be upon him, was confronted with the fact that the Quranic revelation often spoke in male terms, the Prophet, peace be upon him, didn't have an answer from himself, like, why is it like this? But then subsequent revelations in the 33rd chapter of the Quran then began to state specifically that it's not only men, but it's men and women who pray, men and women who fast, and so on. All of these actions, which are judged to be righteous actions in Islam, are equally acceptable from both men and women. It so turns out that in the Arabic language, it is so set that when we speak of a whole group, including men and women, the masculine forms of verbs and nouns are used. Mm-hmm. Whereas only if we're speaking about specifically women would a feminine gendered narrative ensue.
So how can we foster this? We talked about the revolutionary spirit. How can we foster that today to make changes in society? I mean, we see that Muslim women aren't doing all that well compared to Muslim men in some parts of the world. So what can we do about that? Can we use Islam to improve the status of women?
First, we need to recognize what the main problem in this regard is in Muslim societies. We have spoken about the revolutionary nature of the Islamic teachings regarding the rights of women compared with what was there before in Arabia in the 7th century of our common era.
And all Muslims recognize that that's a great thing.
Yes, exactly. But then where is the problem? The problem is that Muslims tended to see that whatever was stated in the Quran or reported from the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, as his sayings, these were the end stage. That's it. That's the final demarcation of rights and responsibilities and roles for men and women. We didn't see that these are actually stipulations that are part of a progress which should continue. These to me are the seeds of growth and progress, which Muslims should have continued to water and to nurture and to let grow. But we didn't let that happen. In the meantime, other societies which started out with the backward nature of things from olden times continued gradually to advance. And it took a while for many European states to grant women some of the rights which Islam had already granted them some 14 centuries ago. But once women were given these rights in these other societies, it did not stop there, but they continued to make further progress and to receive more rights and recognition of their value in the other societies, with the result now that Islamic societies tend to appear backward in this regard, and the other societies tend to appear far advanced. And usually we would justify our backwardness in this regard by pointing to the dilapidated nature of some of the modern advances. Like we might point to the fact, for example, that women in modern times suffer from many problems which traditionally women did not suffer from. Certain new diseases, subject to new exploitation, as for example in the pornographic industry. But these aberrations aside, we should still recognize that women in most parts of the world nowadays have advanced far beyond the way things were in traditional times. And Muslims should look back at our own tradition and see what has actually kept us back from this kind of progress. Is it a kind of literalness, a sort of traditionalism that wanted to interpret the text of the Quran the way it has always been interpreted, and we're not looking at the realities of life? And to me, this is exactly what the problem is. So again, we can continue the prophetic revolution in many different areas of life, including the specific area of advancing women's rights. In fact,
how do you suggest we begin to do that?
Yeah, I was going to say not only that we can do it, but we must. It is a religious imperative. And how do we do it? Well, first we go back to those interpretations which are classic, and we recognize that the scholars who advanced those interpretations of certain verses of the Quran did so in good faith and in view of the current situation, the way in which life was at the time. There are certain things which would have been deemed to be sacrilegious, unthinkable at the time. And even though it would have advanced women's rights in certain ways, there were other negative effects. You see, there's a certain psychology of religion, a feeling that comes with certain acts, a feeling that either confirms our closeness to God or makes a person feel distant from God. And some of the advances of women in modern times may still seem to some traditionally inclined individuals as being sacrilegious, contrary to codes of decency and moral uprightness and so on. So at one time, all of this would have been shunned and thought to be totally outside of the purview of religion and outside of the scope of Islamic thinking. But as societies advance and we see that people become accustomed to interactions between men and women, for example, then we go back to our tradition and we realize that in fact interactions between men and women were never actually originally taboo. If you think about men and women's circumambulating the Kaaba. This is the most sacred act of worship in the Islamic faith, where the people are circumambulating the house of God. This is one of the acts and the rites of pilgrimage. Men and women are actually there rubbing shoulders with each other. The men are often dressed as required within the actual core of the pilgrimage rites to be dressed in two pieces of unstitched clothing, which means that often their shoulders are bare. And people are there crowding, pressing against each other. Parts of each other's bodies are becoming like intermingled with arms and so on. So this is inevitable, but it is understood that people are there not for any ill intention or seeking sensuous sorts of experiences, but they're there for the sole purpose of worshiping God, and they're devout of mind. So the other things are there, but they can be ignored for the moment.
Even in the time of the Prophet, it seems like women were involved in the social and political scene. For example, in times of battle, women also partook in battle.
Yes, yes. So where I want to take this then is to say that it were later interpreters who started to put restrictions. For example, you will find in the books of hadith that people start to say, well, when it comes to circumambulating the Kaaba, the women should go on the outskirts and not mingling with the men. But this is really a later sort of prescription. And it's not a prescription that is widely followed. We still, to this day, have men and women circumambulating the Kaaba together.
So how was it okay for people to come about later and put additional restrictions on women then?
Well, here's where that religious sensitivity comes in. Like later on, people are looking at this and saying, well, you know, we've been doing it for a while like that, but it's not really right that we should do it this way. Isn't it better if the women just keep aloof from the men? And somebody says, yeah, that reflects more modesty and decency. Yeah, let's do it that way. That sounds like a good idea. And they don't realize at the time, or it doesn't become a problem at the time, that they're actually departing from the original prophetic practice, the way it was left in the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him. Now, nowadays, when a youth wants to find the original and true teachings of Islam, he goes back to the classical works, collections of hadith, interpreters of Islam, and so on. And they think that is really the original situation, not realizing that the original situation was actually different. And if we can actually bring back some aspects of the original situation, it may be a solution to some of our problems. Now, I'm not asking for us to do things which are contrary to modesty and so on beyond necessity, but we need to balance things. There's always a trade-off. If you have too much of this, you lose some of the other. And what has happened in traditional Muslim societies is that in order to preserve the modesty of women, in order to preserve a sense of decency in society and so on, we have gone to so much of an extreme on that one sort of consideration that we lose out on the other considerations, to the extent where, for example, in Saudi Arabia it becomes prohibited for a woman to drive, even if not by legislative decree. At least this is what is accepted in practice. So we limit the activities of women, we limit the freedoms of women, we limit their opportunities for growth and progress, for development, for contributing to society, and so on.
Is it even possible to peel back those layers to get back to the original position, as you mentioned?
Yes, it is always possible, and in fact it is a religious imperative. It is necessary for us to do that, because our initial mandate is to follow God and His messenger, and the later interpreters may be right or wrong. They could be guides to God and His messenger, but they're not the be-all and end-all. It doesn't end with their saying. Anyone's sayings could be right or wrong, whereas God and His Prophet are always right, according to Muslim belief. So Muslims need to go back to the Quran and see what specifically does it say, and how to interpret it in the light of present realities. We have to go back to the Prophet's example and see what he did by way of teaching us the permanent teachings of Islam, and what he did by way of simply adhering to the kinds of practices and modes and mores that would have been acceptable at his time, because there was no need to change any of that given the present circumstances.
Very quickly, do you think, how would you respond to critics who say that the Quran is patriarchal?
The Quran was revealed at a time when society was largely patriarchal, and there are many things which the Quran did not see it necessary to confront at the time, because there were some other more important issues at hand. For example, the core issues for the Quran was to teach that there is only one God, that we will eventually resurrect from the dead and answer for our crimes in the life hereafter, and that God is giving us revelation through prophets and messengers to teach us how to live in this life, so that when we go back to answer before Him, we actually have all of the answers ready-made because we have lived the answer. So these are the three things, that there is only one God, that there is an accountability in life after death, and that we have a revelation and instruction from God. These beliefs were so important that this is what the bulk of the Quran is concerned with. So there are some other issues which were left basically unscathed, because there was a need to concentrate on these issues, but we should never interpret the Quran as though the Quran is condoning patriarchy and accepting this as part of its own ethos. On the other hand, the Quran has indications that men and women are equal. For example, Surah 2, 228th verse, says, وَلَهُنَّ مِثْلُ الَّذِي عَلَيْهِنَّ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ. They have rights equal to the kinds of responsibilities they have according to what is known and customary.
All right, we'll leave it at that. We appreciate that, Dr. Shabir Ali.
You're welcome.
We'll take a break. When we return, can we use robots and technology for religious worship?